One Piece isn't about the fights. That's a mantra that's been repeated countless times within the fandom. It initially started as a way to combat the toxicity that could arise from power scaling discussion, but it's also been used to rebut the potential criticism that One Piece has weaker action scenes in comparison to other battle shonen. And it's a mantra I utterly disagree with. Not because it's an invalid defense, but rather an unnecessary one that discredits an aspect of shonen writing I believe Oda's quite good at. But let me clarify a few things first. I am not saying that fights are the most important part of One Piece. They are far from its main draw. I believe that's why this perspective is so widely held. It doesn't matter that One Piece doesn't have the choreography of Naruto, the strategy of JoJo's, or pre-Wano, the production quality of JJK. Because, at the end of the day, we don't care about Luffy punching Lucci, we care about how Luffy punching Lucci makes us feel. That much I can get behind, but I also don't think it tells the whole story. Effective storytelling through action should be a standard for any good battle series. One Piece isn't exempted from one half of the equation just because it exceeds in the other. But moreover, it doesn't need to be exempted. One Piece meets that standard and absolutely deserves to be in the discussion of great anime-manga action. And the way in which it succeeds is, in my opinion, incredibly distinct from other series. So today, I want to talk about both why I believe One Piece's fight scenes have such a stigma around them, and what it does to so uniquely make me love them. Quick thing though, this video will primarily be discussing the manga. 1, because it's the version of the story I'm mainly familiar with, 2, because some of my praise is exclusive to it, and 3, because I don't think the recent fights in the anime need any defending. And hey, if you enjoy this type of anime analysis, especially on fight scenes, why not like the video and subscribe? There's already a whole playlist of fight analyses you can check out after this one. Starting off, understanding the reputation of One Piece's action requires evaluating it in relation to other series. So first, I'll examine how One Piece fares in the two areas manga action generally garners praise in: art and strategy. Beginning with art. Action art itself can really be subdivided further into two main appeals. On one hand, there's paneling, page flow, and composition, all the stuff that tries to trick your brain into thinking it's looking at movement and not just a series of stills. On the other, there's detailed spectacle, the hype that comes from looking at those full or two-page spreads. I actually believe One Piece sees success in both of these areas, albeit which and to what extent depends on where in the series we're looking at. When discussing action and page flow, the gold standard is obviously the late Akira Toriyama. The popularity of Dragonballz, and particularly Z's action, is almost entirely thanks to Toriyama's ability to make the flow of action and choreography across a page seamlessly intense. Toriyama's paneling style has been dissected in extreme detail by several people, but to sum up that discussion, its strengths come down to three main qualities. 1, uncluttered page layouts, which allow for large panels depicting character action in great clarity. 2, simple, readable action within panels that flow together seamlessly through a step-by-step progression of motion, which feels seamless thanks to 3, an extraordinary ability to create a line of action across the page. So, looking at all this in comparison to One Piece, what do we get? Well, I don't think I could name you any point in the series where Oda matches Toriyama's ability to create a line of action. But I also don't know if I could name you any mangaka that does. But if we look at panels and page layouts, early One Piece shows us a very similar emphasis on large panels with simple layouts in depicting character action. More than flowing, though, I think I'd describe Oda's paneling as methodical. Rather than each panel depicting an action that seamlessly transitions into the next, One Piece will dedicate several panels to giving a sense of perspective and motion to a single action. Luffy vs. Arlong has several great examples of this. Like, look how much detail is given to a motion as simple as a punch by Luffy. 2.5 pages are dedicated to this attack. We trace every movement, from Arlong batting the sword away to this panel, which clearly illustrates Arlong in the middle of that motion from a different angle. Then we get the wind-up to Luffy's punch, and then we get the impact and follow-through from 2 different angles, and then 2 more just to show Arlong's teeth cracking and shattering. That said, Luffy shattering Arlong's teeth is a pretty impactful part of the fight. Surely that level of detail isn't dedicated to every motion, right? Wrong! Look at this sequence of Luffy pinned against the pillar. We get a panel for Arlong slamming Luffy against it, then a panel that feels like a logical extension of that, Arlong charging in to bite him. It's similarly positioned and angled, but from a reverse perspective. Then we get the result of that panel in Luffy dodging, before we zoom out to show the pillar crumbling between Arlong's jaws. What Oda's doing here actually mimics a technique used in cinematography and editing: shot sequencing. That is, stringing together tight, medium, and wide shots of the same subject to create a sense of progression. By doing this, Oda can give us multiple snapshots of the same motion while still allowing things to feel like they're progressing. We get such a detailed understanding of how each character is moving that there's hardly even any blanks we have to mentally fill in. If Dragon Ball's paneling is a tapestry woven together by a line of action, One Piece's is something akin to a flipbook. And while I'm aware that's not the most flattering analogy, it is one that I mean with praise. But if One Piece's paneling is so distinct and impressive, why isn't it more talked about? Well, I do think there are two caveats that keep it from being a significant part of One Piece's reputation. The first is adaptation. If you're talking about One Piece and haven't read the manga, these strengths don't really translate to the anime. But that's the same for any series, so why is it relevant for One Piece in particular? Well, unlike Studio Pierrot for Naruto, or Toei themselves with Dragon Ball, for most of its run, the One Piece anime did little to add on to fights in any way that would make them more complex or engaging in motion. The earliest fight I at least know of that the anime really overhauled was Luffy vs. Katakuri, which... yeah... And that's an issue, because One Piece's strengths in manga form actually kind of hold it back in animation. The price of clarity in manga is often simplicity, which is, again, great in that context. But when translating an imitation of motion to the real thing, the advantage is lost. That perfect progression of panels that creates the feeling of Arlong charging at and biting a pillar becomes just Arlong charging at and biting a pillar. Simplicity works great for creating a sense of choreography in motion, but when it is choreography in motion, it's just kind of lackluster. Regarding the manga itself, though, I think the second reason is that Oda doesn't use this style of paneling throughout the entire series. I mentioned that this is the style of early One Piece, and that's because I think this type of paneling really peaks around Enies Lobby, and oh boy does it ever peak. Luffy vs. Lucci is arguably the most iconic fight in the series for a reason. It's on a whole nother level of intensity and kineticism in the manga. Past this point, though, there's a notable shift in Oda's style from simple clarity to more complex and detailed compositions. Just comparing Zoro vs. Kaku to Zoro vs. Ryuma, you can already see how panels don't really depict every step of emotion. Rather, they focus on more detailed impact shots. And then if we look at Zoro vs. King, there's a lot more going on in each panel, which makes the motion harder to parse at a glance. That's not necessarily a bad thing, though, because while Oda's page flow might not remain as strong throughout the series, what's gained instead is spectacle. I don't think much explanation is needed to get across how beautiful, detailed art creates a sense of gravitas and hype for fights in manga and similar mediums. Solo Leveling, One Punch Man, Tokyo Ghoul, series whose action is beloved simply because of how pretty it looks. And while I won't say One Piece is on that level at any point in its run, just look at some of these compositions from post-time skip, especially Wano and Egghead. That shift in focus towards more detailed impact panels lends itself to an even greater emphasis on each major moment in a fight. It makes those key scenes feel earth-shaking. The more the series goes on, the more Oda excels at making fights feel larger than life and impactful. Roof Piece and Luffy taking on the Gorosei feel like the clashes of titans that they should be. Though even before that, the single biggest testament to his ability in this regard may very well be Marineford. So much is going on in each panel, yet it's all rendered in so much detail that rather than being hard to follow, it just allows you to marvel at the scale of this massive battle, a real clash between the greatest powers in this world. There's a reason this arc is almost straight action and renowned as One Piece's greatest high point. Because every single story beat is complemented with the appropriate amount of intensity and hype. So then, what's missing in all of this? Sure, I don't think anybody's lambasting One Piece's art, but again, what is it lacking to still be left out of the fight conversation? I think the answer lies in how I was forced to structure this section. It's hard for One Piece's art to be known for anything. Its strengths are significant, but they shift over the course of the series. We're neither thrust into immediate grandeur, nor do we experience consistent, high-paced paneling. That's not an indictment of the series, but I'd wager that's why, despite having great action art in multiple different ways, it's still not talked about among the best of them. And I think that trend carries over into our second suspect. When talking about strategy in One Piece fights, a lot of people will tell you that Haki ruined everything. They'll say that strategy was thrown out the window when post-time skip started, and now everything is about punching each other with enhanced fists. But that isn't true on either end of things. I'm hardly the biggest fan of Haki's implementations myself, especially armament, but pre-time skip certainly wasn't all strategies with Hunter x Hunter levels of depth, and post-time skip hasn't completely disregarded that depth either. To cut to the chase, the reason One Piece fights aren't known for their strategy is because the actual level of strategy on display is wildly inconsistent throughout the series. Sure, on one hand we can look at a character like Usopp, since his whole MO is using tactics to outmaneuver opponents with superior physicality and abilities. Which is all of them. Since that trait is a defining part of his character, he gets a consistent selection of tactically engaging battles across the whole series. From his tag team with Chopper and Alabasta, to beating Perona via trauma, to beating Sugar via trauma, to my favorite fight in the series where he pulls out every trick in the book in a desperate bid to prove himself against Luffy. Regardless of what point in the series, Usopp's fights are always a showcase of his ability to think outside the box, because that's his appeal. On the other hand, we can look at a character like Zoro and how he wins his fights. That includes learning to cut metal, to turning his swords into a cannon, to learning Ashura, and let's not forget a handful of instances of just winning. Now, I am playing this up for comedy. Most of Zoro's fights are great for completely different reasons. In-depth strategy isn't required to make a good fight. But that is to say that from the inception of his character, Zoro's fights haven't been about tactics. They mainly aim to either progress his power and skill, or simply to showcase it. The context and purpose of a fight heavily influences the way Oda chooses to write it. In a way, that's maybe more variable than a lot of other shonen authors. A more extreme example of this is the contrast between Luffy's second and third fights against Crocodile. The former is actually the more tactically complex of the two, with Luffy creating several means of hitting Crocodile with water to then properly damage him. Luffy's experimentation is facilitated by a far lighter tone, which also fits with this fight's place in the arc as a momentary reprieve from the tension before ratcheting it back up again. Meanwhile, the fight in the catacombs is far simpler, just an all-out brawl, but that feels contextually appropriate. The simpler combat serves to narrow the focus of the fight on its crumbling environment and the power of Luffy's sheer will. This approach has remained true up through the series' most recent arcs. Hawkins had an ability which demanded that he couldn't be toppled with just brute force, so we got an incredibly clever and satisfying solution to the question his fight with Killer posed. In the same arc, there's examples like how well the plan to split up Kaido and Big Mom makes use of Kid and Law's abilities. As recently as Wano's climax, we still get fights which encourage the characters to use their abilities or surroundings in clever ways. But in terms of strategy, nothing, not pre nor post time skip, tops Luffy versus Katakuri. A fight that introduces a more creative ability for Haki than we'd seen previously, then even after Luffy learns the basics of it, demands that he find an alternate way of countering it, given that he still can't keep up. Through that, we force our protagonist to creatively apply previously established powers, in Gear Second's increased speed and Boundman's trajectory changing. We clearly follow Luffy's thought process on how Snake Man allows him to bridge the gap by being able to exploit the one weakness he's found in Katakuri's skill set. It's one of my favorite transformations in Shonen, because I can hardly think of another where the impetus is not a character moment or a dramatic climax, but a carefully crafted plan. It's stellar. And it's also the only time in the series something like it is given so much focus. The first question I posed in this video was, why don't One Piece's action scenes have a more positive reputation within its community? And as I've outlined, the answer to that is actually rather simple. There's a lack of consistency in what One Piece's action is. It is often great, but to garner a reputation, you need something to consistently define yourself by. And One Piece's fights never found a winning formula that Oda just continued iterating upon. They vary vastly, which is likely why the anime community at large seldom sees them as part of the series' brand. That's by no means a bad thing. One Piece isn't about the fights. They don't dictate the story's creative direction, they're at its whims. Look at the art style change again. Sure, it doesn't serve intricate fight choreography the best, but it's clear that Oda pivoted to it to depict the scale of more intricate scenes, and its merit is especially obvious in some utterly gorgeous establishing shots. For a story that's been going for nearly 30 years, I think it's, if anything, impressive that Oda's been able to consistently morph the medium it's told through, its action, to fit the tone or style it needs to. One Piece evolves, and every aspect of its structure evolves with it. With all that said, the idea that One Piece lacks a consistent strength to defy its action is merely what I've come to assume the community's unstated opinion is. That's not what I personally think. There is a facet of action design where I think One Piece succeeds to a degree that few other series do. And to explain it, I think it's best to look at the arena where everyone agrees One Piece is king. I'm well aware that I'm preaching to the choir in saying this, but there really is so much to appreciate about One Piece's world building. Its poignant yet still approachable criticism of government oppression, the way its distinguishing elements like devil fruits inform several structures and technologies within it, its ability to make the figures that stand at its apex feel truly larger than life. But are those its distinctions? The things that truly set it apart in the discussion of anime-manga world-building? Its reputation, if you will. Personally speaking, I don't believe they're what I would point to. Other series have done those things. Maybe not all at once, and maybe you could argue One Piece still does them better, but they aren't exclusive to it. What One Piece does have that I think you'd truly struggle to find in another work is its world's vastness and variety. The reason Oda's been able to spend 1,000 plus chapters exploring dozens of unique locations isn't necessarily because each has the most complex social structures or in-depth mechanics. It's simply the thrill of seeing what he comes up with next. One Piece has a pure creativity in its world building that allows almost nothing to feel out of place. We've seen fantastical send-ups of realistic locales like Alabasta and Wano, and they render their inspiration about as effectively as you could ask for while injecting One Piece's trademark cartooniness. We've seen unique plays on established tropes like Skypiea, we've seen straight-up jokes like Long Ring Longland, and then there's places like Whole Cake and Egghead, locations that are so, for lack of a better term, cartoony, that they'd easily feel outlandish or out of place in another series. However, One Piece, having established that cartooniness as a consistent part of its style, allows Oda a full range from surrealism down to more standard fantasy affair. The result of all this is that everything in One Piece's world feels truly fresh. That idealized sense of exploration is backed up by a world that promises to show you things you not only haven't seen, but likely haven't even thought of around every corner. In so many words, I think it's accurate to just say that Oda has a knack for conceptualizing and actualizing unique ideas and cool aesthetic flourishes. Which is precisely why it's so puzzling to me that his action isn't held in higher regard. Because the greatest strength of One Piece's fights is the same as the greatest strength of One Piece's world building. Power systems and individual abilities are usually among the first topics of discussion when examining the fights of any given battle shonen. Most of those succeed thanks to intuitive complexity that allows for depth in their tactics. We've already discussed how One Piece fares in that regard. What's harder to analytically quantify, but has proven to be just as important in making appealing action scenes, are not just the complexity within those abilities, but simply the ideas behind them and the set pieces they're used in, how those are all stylized. I guess you could call this a rule of cool, but rather than try to come up with a definition for it, it's better to demonstrate the effect it can have through examples. One of my favorite instances of this is episode 7 of Jujutsu Kaisen, the one that introduces both Gojo's Infinity and properly explains domain expansions. There is very little going on in this fight when it comes to strategy, but that hardly seemed to matter for its popularity. Gojo vs. Jogo is one of the moments that put JJK on the map, at least in its anime. That's due in no small part to how quickly people latched onto Gojo's power set. Many have pointed out how creative Infinity is as far as abilities which make a character impervious go. There's something enticing about the way Gojo can just casually bend space to his whim. That, combined with how intrigued I was by the reality warping abilities of domain expansions, compelled me so much that I made a whole video on this fight within the week it came out. But you don't even need something as complex or even as creative as Infinity to stand out. Look at how downright iconic Yuji's fighting style has become, simply because so many find the idea of tackling a world with outlandish magic abilities with nothing but these hands to be Well, cool. It says something that even in a series that loves to explain every minutia of its power system, its most iconic action set pieces aren't contingent on that. Frequently, people turn to the satisfaction of Yuji pummeling Mahito against a pillar, the beautiful strength of Hollow Purple, or the terrifying destructive ability of Malevolent Shrine. I don't think it's necessarily because of their simplicity. Look at the most iconic moments from JoJo's or Hunter x Hunter. Usually, those fights capitalize on their complexity. But with something like JJK, I think those simpler action beats hit because of what they represent, especially in context of the story. It's inherently captivating. Turning back to One Piece, you can immediately see similar trends in moments and abilities the fandom gravitates towards. I'm not gonna say all of Marco's popularity comes from his Devil Fruit, but I think you'd be hard-pressed to argue that it's not a significant chunk. I, for one, wholeheartedly agree with that popularity. A blue and yellow flamed phoenix that can near instantly regenerate from any damage is not only visually stunning in both the anime and the colored manga, but allows for a fun pattern in Marco's fights where Oda can give an appropriate gravitas to his opponent in showing how much they can do, only for Marco to look even cooler by comparison when he heals it off and hits it back. Part of it is thanks to how sparingly he is used, but nonetheless it never fails to generate hype. For a character used less sparingly but to equaling great effect, I'd look no further than Law. Room is honestly a fascinating ability to me, simply because it's so unlike anything else. Sure, I guess you could qualify it as spatial manipulation like Infinity, and there are definitely moments where there's a similar appeal of Law having full command over the battlefield with just a few flicks of the wrist. But really, its theme is control, which allows Oda to make it include anything from teleportation to levitation to guaranteed hit slashes that draw no blood, to direct attacks to an opponent's internal organ. It's a wildly vast assortment of abilities that manage to feel like a cohesive power set thanks to the unique idea of Law enclosing a space to be specifically under his control. That makes his fights a joy to read and watch, whether he be dominating or using his versatility to bridge a gap between himself and someone stronger. Anecdotally, I remember how, after getting kind of burnt out on the series after Fishman Island, that visual of Law levitating a marine ship by just holding up one finger was so sick, it got me hyped about One Piece all over again. I truly feel like there's endless examples I could use in this section. Sanji vs. Queen is one of my favorite fights, yes for its narrative, but also because Queen has no limit to the number of weird tricks he wants to play with. One that I really want to mention is how, even with basic elemental abilities, the way Oda portrays them makes them feel new again. With Ace, the way you can never quite tell where his body ends and the fire begins, coupled with the way he molds it into loose constructs like spears, this fire pillar, or Entei, make it feel like no other firepower I've seen, and make for some awesome visuals in his fight with Blackbeard and the Marineford escape. Or there's Akainu's lava, which Oda seems to have taken special care in making more brutal than any other attacks in the series, giving it that distinctiveness. Even something as simple as the way Kizaru's lightspeed contrasts his slow demeanor works to make him stand out not only among One Piece characters, but among the canon of characters with similar abilities to him. It's not even limited to Devil Fruit users. We've already talked about how much surprising creativity is packed into Usopp's toolkit, but there's also moments like the spectacle of all 9 scabbards charging Kaido. All that said though, there is one character who, more than any other, embodies One Piece, who allows its action to fully reflect the creativity that permeates its entire world. Sure, there are other characters whose fights are appealing thanks to their versatile toolkits, letting Oda go truly wild with his imagination, but where do I even begin with Gear 5th? Grabbing lightning, making Luffy a giant, laser goggles, punches through the floor, becoming Pac-Man, cause why not? There's been an endless discourse about how Gear 5th is a perfect power-up thematically, both for Luffy's character and One Piece's world. And for all those same reasons, it's the perfect power-up for One Piece's action. It's a pure embodiment of fun, and while I understand the tonal concerns that's raised for some, I for one find it impossible to not get swept along in that joyous adrenaline when reading Luffy's use of that form to its full extent. It's almost ironic that the main character being granted the most ridiculously overpowered ability in the world encourages his fighting style to become more out of the box than ever before. This is One Piece. Luffy's overbearing enthusiasm for discovery and freedom warping the world around him into something simply more fun. action that's highest escalation is to fuel its author's penchant for the absurd. I understand that it's not everybody's cup of tea. I'd be lying if I said there weren't times throughout One Piece that same principle has grated on me. But in this context, I can't help but adore it. Because what more could I want when cheering on Monkey D. Luffy than to see the craziest ideas count as a valid battle plan? Few stories really seek to be defined by their action scenes. One Piece isn't one of them, but nonetheless, its genre demands that action be the medium that its story is told through. In that case, is it not best that its fight scenes reflect what makes the story surrounding them so compelling? The same way we anticipate the next location with bated breath, do we not also look forward to seeing what abilities new combatants may have? I know I do. And I continue to. Because even when One Piece's fights aren't the most strategic or the most beautifully drawn or the most intricately paneled, they have this amazing ability to make me just stare at the page and, like a child, have nothing to say but, "That's so cool."